A millionaire CEO needed a fake husband for one night, but when she chose a single dad, his little boy whispered a truth so shocking it could ruin her empire, or finally give her the family she never thought she deserved. Will she risk everything for love? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The city lights twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Grace Whitmore's penthouse office, casting long shadows across her mahogany desk. She sat rigid in her leather chair, staring at the board memo until the words blurred together. Her manicured fingers tightened around the paper, creating small creases in its pristine surface. "Family values, image," she muttered, tossing the memo aside. The words felt like a slap in the face. 20 years of building Whitmore Industries from the ground up, and now they wanted to judge her personal life? Grace stood and walked to the window, her heels clicking against the marble floor. 50 stories below, the streets pulsed with late-night traffic. Up here, in her carefully constructed world of glass and steel, she felt more alone than ever. Her assistant's gentle knock broke the silence. "Miss Whitmore? I have that list you requested." "Come in, Sarah." Grace didn't turn from the window. Sarah, a petite woman in her 30s, approached with a tablet in hand. "I found several candidates who match your criteria, but there's one in particular I think you should consider." She hesitated. "He's not exactly what you specified, but just tell me." Grace's reflection frowned back at her. "His name is Daniel Carter. He's a mechanic, owns his own shop, widowed, with a 7-year-old son." Sarah swiped through some photos on her tablet. "He's well respected in his community, known for his integrity, and," she paused, "he needs money for his son's medical treatments." Grace finally turned around. "A mechanic? The board would never—" "Maybe that's exactly what you need," Sarah interrupted, then quickly added, "Ma'am, someone genuine, different from the usual suspects they parade through here." Grace took the tablet, studying the photo of a man in his mid-30s. Daniel Carter had kind eyes and a warm smile that seemed to reach through the screen. His son sat on his shoulders in the picture, both of them laughing at something off camera. Something tugged at her heart, an emotion she quickly suppressed. "Set up a meeting," she said, handing back the tablet. "Tomorrow morning." The next day, Grace stood at her office window again, this time watching a slightly battered pickup truck pull into her private parking space. Daniel Carter stepped out, looking up at the towering building with visible apprehension. Even from this distance, she could see he'd made an effort, wearing what appeared to be his best shirt and slacks, though they were clearly not designer quality. Minutes later, her office door opened. Daniel Carter was taller in person, his presence filling the room in an unexpected way. Despite his obvious nervousness, he met her gaze directly. "Miss Whitmore," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, honest. "Thank you for considering me." Grace gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Please, sit." She noticed a small grease stain on his sleeve that he'd tried to clean. Somehow, that imperfection made her feel more at ease. "Your assistant explained the situation?" "Yes, ma'am." Daniel shifted in his chair. "Though, I have to admit, it sounds a bit like something from a movie." A smile tugged at her lips despite herself. "Life often does." She pulled out a folder. "The arrangement would be simple. You accompany me to the charity gala next month. Pose as my husband. We maintain the facade for a few public appearances afterward. In return," she named a figure that made his eyes widen. "That's generous," he said carefully. "It's what your discretion is worth." Grace studied him. "Why did you agree to meet with me, Mr. Carter?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, his hands clasped in his lap. "My son, Ethan. He has severe asthma. The treatments." He swallowed. "Insurance only covers so much. I've been picking up extra shifts at the shop, but it's not enough." The raw honesty in his voice made Grace uncomfortable. She was used to people coming to her with practice speeches and hidden agendas. This was different. "And you're comfortable with the deception?" she asked. "No," he answered immediately. "But I'd do anything for my son." He met her eyes again. "Would you like to know what else makes me uncomfortable, Miss Whitmore?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Go ahead. This whole situation. You're clearly successful, intelligent. The fact that you need to hire someone to pretend to be your husband? That's not right. His voice was gentle, without judgment. "Whatever pressure they're putting on you, it's not fair." Grace felt her carefully maintained composure crack slightly. No one had spoken to her like this in years. "Life isn't fair, Mr. Carter." "No," he agreed. "It's not. My wife taught me that." His smile was sad but genuine. "But sometimes we find help in unexpected places." Grace stood abruptly, walking to her desk to retrieve the contract. She needed to end this conversation before it veered into territory she wasn't prepared to handle. "The terms are outlined here. Take time to review them with your lawyer." Daniel took the contract, but didn't look at it. "Do you have children, Miss Whitmore?" "No," she said shortly. "Then you might want to know Ethan is part of this deal too. He's smart. He'll have questions." Grace hadn't considered that. Of course, the child would be involved. She felt that same tugging sensation in her chest. "We'll handle that when necessary." Daniel nodded and finally looked down at the contract. After several minutes of silence, he picked up the pen she'd laid out. His signature was steady, decisive. She watched him sign, noting the way his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. When he stood to leave, she found herself saying, "Mr. Carter?" He turned at the door. "Yes?" "Thank you," she said, though she wasn't quite sure what she was thanking him for. He gave her that same gentle smile. "See you at the gala, Miss Whitmore." Then he was gone, leaving Grace alone in her office, staring at his signature on the contract, that strange unease stirring in her heart. The morning sun glinted off Grace's silver Mercedes as it pulled into Carter's auto repair. The small shop stood in stark contrast to her corporate world, a weathered brick building with faded lettering and cheerful hanging baskets of petunias decorating the entrance. The parking lot was already busy with pickup trucks and well-worn sedans. Grace smoothed her navy Armani suit and stepped out of her car, her designer heels immediately catching in a small crack in the concrete. She wobbled slightly, catching herself with practiced grace. The smell of motor oil and rubber filled the air, mixing with the scent of fresh coffee drifting from the shop's open bay doors. Inside, the garage buzzed with activity. Country music played softly from an old radio, competing with the rhythmic sounds of tools and friendly chatter. Two mechanics looked up from under the hood of a rusty pickup truck, their expressions curious at the sight of her. "Miss Whitmore?" Daniel Carter emerged from behind a lifted car, wiping his hands on a red shop rag. Unlike yesterday's cleaned-up version in her office, today he wore navy coveralls with "Daniel" stitched above the pocket. A smudge of grease marked his forearm, and his dark hair was slightly mussed. "Mr. Carter." Grace clutched her leather portfolio tighter. "I trust you've reviewed the additional documents I sent over? Please, just Daniel." He gestured toward a small office in the corner. "And yes, I did. Would you like to discuss them in—" "Daddy!" A young voice cut through the garage's ambient noise. A small boy with Daniel's dark hair came bounding out of the office, a toy car clutched in one hand and a half-eaten sandwich in the other. He skidded to a stop in front of Grace, looking up at her with wide brown eyes. "Ethan," Daniel said gently. "Remember what we talked about? Inside voice in the shop?" "Sorry." Ethan's gaze remained fixed on Grace. "Are you the lady who's going to pretend to be my mommy?" The question hit Grace like a physical blow. She felt the color drain from her face, her carefully maintained composure cracking. The portfolio suddenly felt heavy in her hands. "Ethan," Daniel's voice was sharp now, though not unkind. "That's not—" "It's all right," Grace managed, forcing a professional smile. "You must be Ethan. Your father has told me about you." Ethan beamed. "Do you like cars? Daddy lets me help sometimes." "Well, just handing him tools and stuff." "Are you rich? Your shoes look fancy?" "They're pretty, but not good for the garage. You might slip." Grace found herself caught between amusement and discomfort at the rapid-fire questions. Daniel stepped in, placing a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Buddy, Miss Whitmore and I need to talk about some grown-up things. Why don't you finish your lunch in the office? Maybe draw another picture for Mrs. Henderson when she picks up her car?" "Okay," Ethan agreed cheerfully. He turned back to Grace. "Will you come visit again? I can show you my car collection next time." "I will see," Grace said carefully, watching as the boy bounced back to the office. Daniel led her to a quiet corner of the garage, away from curious ears. "I apologize for that. I tried to explain things in a way that wouldn't— well, you know how kids are." "It's fine," Grace said automatically, though her hand still trembled slightly as she opened her portfolio. "Let's review the schedule for the next few weeks. The gala is Saturday, but we'll need to be seen together before then to make it convincing." Daniel crossed his arms, leaving a small grease mark on his coverall. "About that, I need to be clear, this arrangement stays completely professional. Ethan's already lost one mother. I won't have him getting attached to someone who's just passing through." The words stung more than they should have. Grace lifted her chin. "Of course. This is strictly business, Mr. Carter. Now, regarding public appearances." They spent the next 20 minutes going over details: restaurants where they'd be spotted, casual outings that would be photographed, the story of their whirlwind romance. Daniel listened intently, asking practical questions about timing and logistics around his work schedule and Ethan's routine. A timer beeped on Daniel's wrist. "Sorry," he said, checking it quickly. "Time for Ethan's inhaler." As if summoned, Ethan poked his head out of the office. "Daddy, is it medicine time?" "Sure is, champ. Come on over." Grace watched as Daniel helped Ethan with the inhaler, his large hands gentle as he counted breaths with practiced ease. The boy's trust in his father was absolute, his small hand gripping Daniel's coverall while he took his medicine. "All done," Ethan announced proudly. He turned to Grace. "Are you leaving? Can you wave goodbye to me from your fancy car?" "Ethan," Daniel warned, but Grace found herself nodding. "I can do that," she said softly. Walking back to her Mercedes, Grace felt oddly unsteady despite her perfect posture. She slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, adjusting her rearview mirror out of habit. In its reflection, she saw Ethan standing in the bay door, waving enthusiastically with both arms. Daniel stood behind him, one hand on his son's shoulder, his expression unreadable. Grace lifted her hand in a small wave, her throat unexpectedly tight. As she pulled away from Carter's auto repair, the weight in her chest felt nothing like the crisp, clean lines of a business arrangement. The setting sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Grace's mansion as Daniel stood awkwardly in front of a full-length mirror. The tailor circled him like a meticulous artist, making final adjustments to his midnight black tuxedo. "Stop fidgeting, Mr. Carter," the tailor muttered, pins held carefully between his lips. Daniel caught Grace's reflection in the mirror. She sat in a plush armchair, her legs crossed elegantly at the ankles, watching the proceedings with careful attention. The mansion's grand sitting room, with its crystal chandelier and antique furniture, made Daniel feel like a fish out of water. "I feel like I'm wearing someone else's skin," Daniel admitted, tugging at his bow tie. Grace rose from her chair, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Here, let me." She stepped in front of him, her fingers working deftly to straighten his tie. "The key is to forget you're wearing it. Act natural. Like you do this every day." "Natural?" Daniel chuckled. "The most dressed up I get is putting on a clean work shirt for church." A small smile tugged at Grace's lips. "Well, you certainly clean up nicely." She stepped back, studying him with an appraising eye that made his cheeks warm. "Daddy!" A high-pitched giggle broke through the tension. Ethan darted into the room, evading the housekeeper who had been watching him in the kitchen. "You look like James Bond." Daniel's face softened as he scooped up his son. "Hey, buddy, shouldn't you be doing your homework?" "Done already," Ethan beamed, then turned to Grace. "Doesn't my dad look like a movie star?" Something flickered in Grace's eyes, a softness Daniel hadn't seen before. "He certainly does." The tailor finished his work and packed up his supplies, leaving them alone to practice their story. Grace perched on the edge of an antique sofa, while Daniel sat across from her, trying not to worry about creasing his new tuxedo. "Remember," Grace said, her CEO voice taking over, "we met at a charity fundraiser last year. You were there supporting local small businesses, and you were impressed by my dedication to the community," Daniel finished. "I know the story, Grace. But what if someone asks for specific details? Like what? Like our first date? Where we got engaged? The little things couples usually remember." Grace's professional facade cracked slightly. I hadn't thought about that. First date was at Luigi's. Ethan piped up from his spot on the floor, where he was playing with a toy car. That's where Daddy took Mommy on their first date. He says it's the best place for spaghetti in town. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Daniel's throat tightened at the mention of his late wife. But Grace surprised him. Luigi's, she said softly. That's perfect, simple, romantic, believable. She made a note on her phone. And the proposal? Daniel thought for a moment. Christmas Eve? Under the big tree in town square? They do this beautiful light display every year. Very romantic, Grace said, but her voice held a hint of wistfulness. You've clearly done this before. That's where Daddy proposed to Mommy, Ethan said matter-of-factly, making both adults freeze. Daniel watched as Grace's composed expression wavered for just a moment. She looked away, blinking rapidly, and he caught a glimpse of something raw and lonely in her eyes. I'm sorry, he said quietly. We can come up with something else. No, Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's a beautiful story. We should use it. She cleared her throat, straightening her shoulders. Now, about tomorrow night. The gala starts at 7. As they went over the details, Daniel noticed how Grace's professional mask would slip occasionally, revealing glimpses of vulnerability underneath. When Ethan asked innocent questions about their pretend relationship, her answers grew softer, less rehearsed. Will you dance with Daddy? Ethan asked. Like in the movies? Grace looked startled. I suppose we should practice that too. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. Mr. Carter? Daniel, he corrected gently, standing to join her. If we're supposed to be married, you should probably use my first name. Daniel, she repeated, and something about the way she said it made his heart skip a beat. He took her hand, placing his other hand carefully at her waist. They moved in a simple box step, and Daniel was surprised to find that years of dancing with his little sister at family weddings hadn't gone to waste. You're full of surprises, Grace murmured, a genuine smile touching her lips. So are you, he replied, without thinking. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the pretense fell away. Grace's careful mask cracked completely, and Daniel saw the woman beneath, brilliant, powerful, but achingly alone. Then Ethan giggled, breaking the spell, and they stepped apart. It's getting late, Daniel said, checking his watch. We should head home. Early day tomorrow. Grace nodded, her professional demeanor sliding back into place. The car will pick you up at 6. Don't forget your cufflinks. She handed him a small velvet box. Come on, buddy, Daniel called to Ethan. Time to go. Bye, Miss Grace, Ethan waved enthusiastically. You look pretty when you smile. A faint blush colored Grace's cheeks as she waved back. Daniel gathered their things, and soon father and son were heading out into the evening air. After they left, Grace stood in the quiet of her massive sitting room. Her fingers found one of Daniel's cufflinks on the side table. He'd forgotten to take both. The silver was warm from where he'd worn it during their practice session. She traced its smooth edge, remembering the surprising grace with which he'd moved during their dance, the genuine warmth in his eyes when he smiled at his son. The stirring in her chest unsettled her. This was business, she reminded herself firmly. Just business. But as she stood there holding his cufflink, Grace couldn't quite convince herself it was that simple anymore. The grand ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation sparkled like a sea of stars. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across marble floors, while string musicians played softly from a corner stage. Grace's hand rested in the crook of Daniel's arm as they paused at the top of the sweeping staircase. Remember to breathe, Daniel whispered, noticing how Grace's fingers tightened against his sleeve. Camera flashes erupted like lightning as the unlikely couple descended. Grace wore a midnight blue gown that shimmed with each step, while Daniel cut an impressive figure in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The Ice Queen of Whitmore Industries had arrived with a husband no one knew existed. "Mrs. Whitmore," called out a reporter from behind the velvet rope. "When did you get married?" Grace's practiced smile never wavered. "Some things are worth keeping private," she answered smoothly, but Daniel felt her pulse racing where their arms touched. They made their way through the crowd, stopping every few steps to shake hands or exchange pleasantries. Daniel's natural warmth drew people in. He remembered names, asked genuine questions, and shared honest laughs. His humble charm was like a warm breeze through the stuffiness of high society. "I hear you're in the automotive industry?" a portly board member asked Daniel, swirling his champagne. "Just a mechanic with a small shop," Daniel replied with an easy smile. "Nothing quite as grand as all this." The man's eyebrows shot up. "A mechanic? How? Interesting." Grace tensed beside Daniel, but he just chuckled. "You'd be surprised how many life lessons you learn under the hood of a car. Just yesterday, I was working on this old Chevy." He launched into a story about helping a stranded elderly couple, turning what could have been an awkward moment into a heartwarming tale about community. More people gathered to listen. Daniel's authenticity was magnetic. He didn't try to pretend he belonged in their world of wealth and privilege. Instead, he brought his world to them, painting pictures of everyday kindness and real human connections. Grace watched in amazement as the crowd warmed to him. These people who usually circled her like sharks now smiled genuinely, charmed by Daniel's unpretentious stories and obvious integrity. The evening's speeches began, and to Grace's horror, the MC called Daniel to the podium. They hadn't prepared for this. She squeezed his hand in warning, but he just winked at her and walked confidently to the stage. "Folks, I'm not much for fancy speeches," Daniel began, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "But I know something about what brings people together. In my line of work, I see all kinds of people having all kinds of bad days. Rich, poor, young, old. When your car breaks down, none of that matters. What matters is how we help each other through the tough spots." The room fell silent, hanging on his words. Even the waiters paused in their rounds. "That's what tonight is about, isn't it? Coming together to help others? Grace, my wife, she taught me that real strength isn't in what you have, but in what you give." He looked directly at her, his eyes sincere. "She might run a big company, but what makes her special is how she uses that success to lift others up." Grace felt tears pricking at her eyes. In that moment, she wished desperately that his words were true, that she was the person he described. Applause thundered through the ballroom. Several people wiped at their eyes. When Daniel returned to Grace's side, she noticed how different the looks were now. Gone were the calculating stares and judgmental whispers. People smiled warmly, genuinely. For the rest of the evening, Grace found herself relaxing into their pretense. Daniel's steady presence beside her felt like a shield against the usual pressure and politics. When he led her onto the dance floor, his hand warm against her waist, she almost forgot it was all an act. "You're a natural," she murmured as they swayed to the music. "Just being myself," he replied simply. "Sometimes that's enough." The night wound down, and they made their graceful exit. In the privacy of the limousine, Grace kicked off her heels with a very un-CEO-like groan of relief. Daniel loosened his bow tie, and suddenly they were both laughing, the kind of laughter that bubbles up from somewhere deep and real. "Did you see Mrs. Henderson's face when you told that story about the cat stuck in the engine?" Grace wiped at her eyes, careful of her makeup. "I thought she was going to adopt me on the spot," Daniel chuckled. "Though not as priceless as when you snorted during Mr. Peterson's long-winded speech about golf." "I did not snort," Grace protested, but she was still smiling. The tension of the evening melted away in the quiet darkness of the car. For the first time in years, Grace felt the weight of her carefully constructed persona slip away. She wasn't performing for the board, for the press, for her father's ghost. She was just herself. The realization hit her like a warm wave. She felt alive, present, real. Daniel's shoulder brushed against hers as the car turned a corner. Neither of them moved away. They sat in comfortable silence, the city lights streaming past the windows like shooting stars. Morning sunlight streamed through the leaves of an old maple tree, casting dappled shadows on Daniel's modest two-story home. Grace's sleek black Mercedes looked out of place parked next to Daniel's weathered pickup truck in the gravel driveway. She smoothed her silk blouse, feeling oddly nervous as she approached the front porch with its peeling white paint and hanging flower baskets. Before she could knock, The screen door burst open. Ethan bounded out, his dark curls bouncing, wearing dinosaur pajamas, and a bright smile that lit up his whole face. "Grace!" he shouted, wrapping his small arms around her waist. His face pressed against her stomach, and she found herself automatically placing a gentle hand on his head. Then came the whispered words that stopped her heart. "Mommy says you're my daddy." Grace's breath caught in her throat. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled against Ethan's soft curls. The world seemed to tilt sideways as memories of her own childhood, cold mansions and absent parents, crashed through her carefully constructed walls. Daniel appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a dish towel. His eyes widened at the scene before him. "Ethan, buddy," he said quickly, moving forward. "Let's give Grace some space." But Grace couldn't move, couldn't speak. Ethan's innocent words had cracked something open inside her that she'd spent years trying to seal shut. "I'm sorry," Daniel said softly, gently pulling Ethan back. He talks about seeing his mom in his dreams." Grace managed a small nod, blinking rapidly to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. It's fine," she whispered. "We're making pancakes," Ethan announced, seemingly unaware of the emotional earthquake he'd just caused. "You should stay. Daddy makes the best pancakes in the whole world." The kitchen was warm and cluttered in a lived-in way that Grace's pristine penthouse never was. A cartoon-themed placemat sat at Ethan's spot at the worn oak table. Crayon drawings decorated the refrigerator, held up by mismatched magnets. A vase of wildflowers, probably picked by Ethan, brightened the windowsill above the sink. "You really don't have to stay," Daniel said, but his voice was kind. "I know you must be busy." "I'd like to," Grace found herself saying, surprising them both. "If that's all right." Ethan cheered and pulled out a chair for her. "You can sit next to me." The normalcy of the morning routine washed over Grace like a warm wave. Daniel moved easily around the kitchen, flipping perfectly golden pancakes, while Ethan chatted about his latest dinosaur discoveries. The boys' enthusiasm was infectious, and Grace found herself drawn into a serious discussion about whether a T-Rex would win in a fight against a Spinosaurus. "Honey or maple syrup?" Daniel asked, placing a stack of pancakes in front of her. "Real maple syrup," Grace answered automatically, then felt her cheeks warm. "I mean, whatever you have is fine." Daniel's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled, reaching for a bottle of the real stuff. "Don't tell anyone, but it's my secret splurge. Nothing beats the real thing." As they ate, Grace watched Daniel and Ethan's easy interaction. The way Daniel cut Ethan's pancakes into perfect bite-sized pieces. How he gently reminded his son to use his napkin. The casual, "love you, buddy," when he ruffled Ethan's hair. It was everything Grace had never had. Everything she'd told herself she didn't need. After breakfast, Ethan insisted on showing Grace his room. The walls were covered in dinosaur posters and more crayon drawings. A well-loved stuffed T-Rex sat guard on his carefully made bed. "This is Rex," Ethan explained seriously. "He keeps the bad dreams away." Grace's throat tightened. "That's very important," she managed to say. When it was time to leave, Ethan hugged her again, gentler this time. "Will you come back?" he asked, his brown eyes wide and hopeful. Grace looked at Daniel, who stood in the doorway with an unreadable expression. "We'll see," she said softly. The drive back to her office felt longer than usual. Every stoplight was an opportunity for Ethan's words to echo in her mind. "Mommy says you're my daddy." Grace gripped the steering wheel tighter, remembering nights spent waiting for her own mother to come say goodnight, nights that always ended in disappointment. She'd built her life around never needing anyone, never letting anyone close enough to matter. But somehow, in the space of a morning, a little boy with dinosaur pajamas and his kind-hearted father had found the cracks in her armor. Grace pulled into her reserved parking space at Whitmore Industries, but didn't immediately get out of the car. The memory of warm pancakes and easy laughter lingered, making her usual world of corporate power plays and board meetings feel suddenly hollow. The heavy oak door creaked as Grace entered her father's old study. Even after 5 years, his presence lingered here, in the leather-bound books lining dark wooden shelves, the faint smell of pipe tobacco, and the massive mahogany desk that dominated the room. She'd preserved it exactly as he'd left it, down to the brass desk lamp and the family photo from her graduation day. Grace's heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she made her way to the desk. She needed to review the company archives for an upcoming board presentation. Her fingers traced the smooth wood before she settled into the high-backed chair, remembering how small she'd felt sitting across from him here as a child. The archive boxes sat waiting, dusty and untouched for years. She pulled the first one closer, lifting the lid carefully. Inside, manila folders contained yellowed papers and old photographs, memories of Whitmore Industries' early days when her father had built it from nothing. An hour passed as Grace methodically worked through the documents. Her eyes grew tired from scanning endless reports and memos. Then something caught her attention. A folder marked Personnel Policies 1985, 1990. She opened it, expecting routine paperwork. Her breath caught. The first page was a memo, stamped Confidential, outlining hiring guidelines that made her stomach turn. Clear discrimination based on race, wrapped in careful corporate language. More documents followed. Internal communications, policy drafts, all bearing her father's signature. "No," Grace whispered, her hands trembling as she spread the papers across the desk. "This can't be right." But it was there in black and white. For years, her father had systematically prevented minorities from advancing within the company. The evidence was damning, complete with statistics carefully manipulated to hide the truth. Grace's chest tightened. She stood abruptly, pacing the study as her mind raced. If this got out, if anyone discovered these documents, everything would crumble. The company's reputation, her father's legacy, her own position, all built on a foundation she never knew was rotten. Her phone buzzed, making her jump. A news alert: mystery man in CEO's life. Who is Grace Whitmore's new husband? The article showed photos from the gala, speculation about Daniel's background already brewing. Grace sank back into the chair, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. The timing couldn't be worse. The press was watching her every move, digging into her personal life. How long before they started digging deeper? She needed time to handle this, to protect the company, to figure out what to do about her father's past. And for that, she needed Daniel. Her fingers shook slightly as she pulled up his number. He answered on the third ring. "Grace?" His voice was warm, touched with concern. "Everything okay, Daniel?" She tried to keep her voice steady. "I need to ask you something." "What's wrong?" The genuine worry in his tone made her chest ache. Grace stood, walking to the window. Outside, the city sprawled beneath gathering storm clouds. "The contract we signed, I need to extend it." "The press attention from the gala. It's more intense than anticipated. I need you to continue playing the role of my husband, just until things settle down." Silence stretched between them. When Daniel spoke again, his voice was careful. "Grace, I thought this was a one-time thing. Ethan's already getting attached and—" "I'll double the payment," she cut in, hating the desperation she could hear in her own voice. "Please, Daniel. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." She could almost see him running a hand through his hair, the way he did when troubled. "This isn't about money, Grace. It's about what's right for Ethan, for all of us." "I know." Grace's free hand pressed against the cool glass of the window. "But I'm asking anyway." Another long pause. Finally, Daniel sighed. "How long?" "A month. Maybe 2. She closed her eyes. "Just until I can handle some complications." "All right," he said softly. "But we need to talk about boundaries. Clear ones this time." "Of course. Thank you, Daniel." Relief flooded through her, but it was short-lived. After ending the call, Grace turned back to the desk. The damning documents lay there, innocent-looking papers that could destroy everything she'd worked for. Her empire suddenly felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse at the slightest breeze. She sank into her father's chair, surrounded by the weight of his legacy. For the first time since taking over as CEO, Grace felt truly alone. The carefully controlled world she'd built was slipping through her fingers, and she wasn't sure even her iron will could hold it together this time. The storm clouds outside finally broke, rain pelting against the windows. Grace sat in the growing darkness, her father's secret spread before her, wondering how many more shadows from the past were waiting to emerge into the light. The evening sun cast long shadows through Daniel's modest living room windows as he and Grace sat on either side of Ethan on the well-worn couch. The 7-year-old's legs swung back and forth, barely reaching the floor, his bright eyes darting between the two adults. "So, buddy," Daniel began, his voice gentle, "Miss Grace and I have something to tell you." He glanced at Grace, who sat with perfect posture despite the old couch's tendency to sink in the middle. "Grace and I will be spending more time together," Daniel continued. "She'll be around the house more often, and we'll be going places together as—" He hesitated on the word family. "Really?" Ethan's face lit up like a Christmas tree. "Like when we go to the park? Or to get ice cream?" Grace's carefully maintained composure softened. "Yes, exactly like that. And maybe I could come to some of your school events too?" "Yes," Ethan bounced on the couch. "Can you come to my science fair next week? I'm making a volcano, and Dad helped me with the lava part. But it's red, and bubbly, and everything." "I'd love to," Grace said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of domestic moments that felt increasingly less like pretense. Grace found herself leaving the office earlier, trading board meetings for homework sessions at Daniel's kitchen table. She learned to navigate Ethan's asthma medication schedule and kept an inhaler in her purse, just in case. One Tuesday afternoon, Grace's sleek black car pulled up to Ethan's elementary school. Children streamed out of the building, and she spotted him immediately, his backpack almost as big as he was. "Grace!" he called out, running toward her. "You came!" "Of course I did," she said, helping him with his backpack. "I promised, didn't I?" In the rearview mirror, she caught sight of other parents watching, probably wondering about the elegant woman in designer clothes picking up the mechanic's son. But for once, Grace didn't care about appearances. Their dinners became a nightly ritual. Grace discovered she loved watching Daniel cook, his strong hands gentle as he taught Ethan to measure ingredients. She learned that Ethan hated green peppers, but would eat them if they were hidden in spaghetti sauce. She found herself looking forward to their conversations about everything and nothing. At the monthly community fair, Grace stood out in her casual clothes, a simple sweater and jeans that still probably cost more than most people's entire outfits. But as she walked between Daniel and Ethan, their hands warm in hers, she felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood: belonging. "Try this," Daniel said, offering her a bite of funnel cake. Powdered sugar dusted his fingers. Grace hesitated. She hadn't eaten carnival food since she was small. But Ethan's encouraging nod made her lean forward and take a bite. The sweetness exploded on her tongue, and she couldn't help but smile. "Good. Right?" Ethan grinned, his own face covered in sugar. "Here," Daniel said softly, reaching up to brush sugar from the corner of her mouth. His touch lingered for a moment too long, and Grace felt her heart skip. They fell into a routine that felt dangerously natural. Grace learned the quiet language of their household, which floorboards creaked, how to tell when Ethan was trying to hide feeling sick, the way Daniel hummed while doing dishes. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Grace arrived at Daniel's house to find Ethan waiting with homework spread across the kitchen table. "I saved the hard math problems for you," he announced proudly. "Dad's good at fixing cars, but you're better at fractions." Grace set down her briefcase and pulled up a chair, something warm blooming in her chest. When had this little boy's approval become so important to her? Later that night, after math was conquered and dinner dishes were cleared, Ethan clutched his favorite book, Where the Wild Things Are, and looked at Grace, hopefully. "Would you read to me tonight?" he asked. "Dad does the voices, but I bet you're good at them too." Grace followed him to his room, taking in the space shuttle bedsheets and the glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling. She sat on the edge of his bed while he snuggled under the covers. "The night Max wore his wolf suit," she began, and was surprised to find she remembered the words from her own childhood. Ethan's eyes grew heavy as she read, but he fought sleep to ask questions and point out his favorite pictures. Grace found herself doing the voices, earning sleepy giggles from the little boy. "Grace?" Ethan mumbled, as she finished the story. "Yes?" "I'm glad you're here," he said, eyes already closed. Grace's throat tightened as she tucked the blanket around his shoulders and smoothed his hair back from his forehead. She placed a gentle kiss there, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and feeling her heart expand almost painfully. When she turned toward the door, she found Daniel leaning against the doorframe, watching. The soft light from the hallway outlined his broad shoulders, and something in his expression made her pulse quicken. His eyes held a mixture of warmth and wariness, like he was trying to remind himself this was all temporary. Grace recognized the look because she'd seen it in her own mirror. The fear of letting this feel too real, too precious. Daniel's hands were shoved deep in his pockets, his stance casual but tense. He watched as Grace gave Ethan one last look before quietly stepping past him into the hallway, both of them pretending not to notice how their arms brushed in the narrow space. They'd gotten too good at pretending this was just business, pretending their hearts weren't involved, pretending they couldn't feel the current of something deeper running beneath every shared smile and casual touch. But watching Grace with Ethan, Daniel felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble, and he wasn't sure he had the strength to rebuild them. The late morning sun glinted off Grace's silver Mercedes as she pulled into Carter's auto shop. The familiar sense of motor oil and rubber filled the air, mixing with the earthy smell of fresh coffee from the break room. Through the open garage doors, she could see Daniel bent over the engine of a beat-up pickup truck, his strong hands working with practiced precision. Mike, one of the other mechanics, spotted her first. He elbowed Daniel playfully. "Hey boss, your fancy wife's here." The words echoed across the garage, causing several heads to turn. Grace expected the familiar surge of irritation that usually came with such comments. Instead, something unexpected happened. She laughed. The sound surprised even her, light and genuine, bubbling up from somewhere deep inside that she'd forgotten existed. "Well, if it isn't the boss's better half." Tommy, another mechanic, called out with a grin. "Come to make sure he's earning his keep." "Actually," Grace played along, smoothing her designer skirt, "I thought I'd inspect the premises, make sure my investment is in good hands." Her delivery was so deadpan that for a moment the mechanics froze, until she winked, sending them into fits of laughter. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Give us a minute, guys?" The other mechanics nodded, drifting away with knowing looks and good-natured ribbing. He led Grace to his small office in the corner of the shop. It wasn't much, just a desk, 2 chairs, and walls covered in certificates and children's drawings. But something about its simplicity felt safe. "You okay?" Daniel asked softly, closing the door. "You don't usually stop by during work hours." Grace sank into one of the chairs, her carefully maintained composure crumbling. "I couldn't stay in that office anymore. The walls were." She pressed her fingers to her temples. "Everything my father built, everything I've worked to protect, it could all fall apart." Daniel pulled the other chair closer, close enough that their knees almost touched. "Tell me." The words spilled out like water from a broken dam. Grace told him about the documents she'd found, about her father's past decisions that now threatened to destroy everything. Her voice shook as she described the weight of protecting not just a company, but a legacy that was both tarnished and precious. "I used to think I could control everything," she whispered, "that if I just worked hard enough, was perfect enough." She looked down at her perfectly manicured hands. "But you can't control the past, can you?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, then reached for a framed photo on his desk. It showed a woman with bright eyes and a radiant smile, holding a toddler-aged Ethan. This was Sarah, 2 months before we lost her. His voice was soft but steady. "For a long time after she died, I thought if I'd just noticed the symptoms sooner, if I'd made her go to the doctor earlier." Grace found herself reaching for his hand before she could stop herself. His fingers were rough from work, warm and solid against hers. "What changed?" she asked. "I realized I couldn't change what happened. But I could choose how to live with it." He squeezed her hand gently. "The guys here, they covered my shifts when I couldn't get out of bed, brought meals when I forgot to eat. Mrs. Johnson next door watched Ethan when I needed to cry. Community, faith, letting people in, that's how you survive the impossible. Grace felt tears threatening. I've spent so long keeping everyone at arm's length, being the ice queen they all think I am. You're not ice, Daniel said firmly. You're steel, strong enough to bend without breaking. He paused, his eyes meeting hers. And you're not alone anymore. Something shifted in the air between them, heavy with unspoken things. Grace found herself studying his face, the kindness in his eyes, the slight worry line between his brows, the way his presence made her feel simultaneously vulnerable and safe. The moment was broken by a knock at the door. Tommy poked his head in. Sorry, boss, but Mrs. Peterson's here for her car. Daniel nodded, reluctantly releasing Grace's hand. I should get back to work. Grace stood, smoothing her skirt more out of habit than necessity. Thank you, she said softly, for understanding. Anytime. The word carried more weight than its 2 syllables should allow. As Grace walked back through the garage, the mechanics called out cheerful goodbyes. She found herself smiling, warming to their easy acceptance of her presence in their world. At her car, she turned back for one last look. Daniel stood in the garage doorway, watching her. The sunlight caught his profile, highlighting the strength in his shoulders, the gentleness in his stance. His expression held something that made her heart flutter, something real, something that had nothing to do with contracts or pretense. She got into her car, her hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. In her rearview mirror, she could see Daniel still watching as she drove away. He didn't move until her car disappeared around the corner. Daniel turned back to the waiting pickup truck, but his mind stayed with Grace, the weight of her hand in his, the vulnerability in her eyes, the way her laugh had transformed her entire face. None of it felt like pretending anymore. His heart knew the truth, even if his mind wasn't ready to acknowledge it yet. The crystal ballroom at the Whitmore Industries headquarters sparkled under massive chandeliers. Men in crisp tuxedos and women draped in designer gowns mingled, their quiet whispers filling the air like angry bees. Grace stood tall in her ivory silk gown, her fingers interlaced with Daniel's as they entered through the grand double doors. The auto mechanic and the CEO, a woman in red, muttered behind her champagne glass. How quaint. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his grip on Grace's hand remained gentle. He'd polished up well in his black tuxedo, but no amount of expensive fabric could hide the calluses on his hands or erase the quiet dignity of a working man. Just breathe, Grace whispered, leaning close. You belong here as much as anyone. But the stares continued as they made their way through the crowd. Board members raised eyebrows. Senior executives turned away. A group of shareholders huddled together, their disapproving glances sharp as daggers. Mrs. Whitmore, Bernard Walsh, the eldest board member, approached them. How progressive of you to bring your new husband to such an important event. His tone dripped with condescension. Grace's spine straightened. Daniel is exactly where he should be, Bernard. Daniel squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her confidence even as his insecurity gnawed at him. He didn't belong in this world of marble floors and crystal stemware. Yet when Grace looked at him, her eyes held nothing but trust. The dinner proceeded with quiet tension. Daniel noticed how Grace's competitors watched them, waiting for him to use the wrong fork or say something inappropriate. But years of raising Ethan had taught him patience. He remained steady, focused on Grace. When it came time for speeches, Grace rose from her seat. The room fell silent as she approached the podium, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Daniel held his breath, knowing how much pressure she was under. Ladies and gentlemen, Grace began, her voice clear and strong. Tonight we celebrate another successful year at Whitmore Industries. But success isn't just about profit margins and market shares. She paused, her eyes finding Daniel's across the room. Something shifted in her expression. A softening, a truth breaking through. This past year has taught me what true success means. It's not about power or prestige. It's about having someone who reminds you to be human. Her voice wavered slightly. Someone who shows you that strength comes in many forms. The room stilled. No more whispers, no clinking glasses. Just Grace, speaking from her heart for perhaps the first time in her corporate life. "My husband Daniel," she continued, "has taught me more about leadership than any business school ever could. He leads with kindness, with integrity, with hands that aren't afraid of honest work and a heart that isn't afraid to be genuine." Daniel's chest tightened. He saw the shocked faces around him, but all he could focus on was Grace, this powerful woman who was laying her armor down piece by piece. "So, yes, I'm different now," Grace said, her smile genuine. "I'm stronger because I've learned that real power isn't about maintaining walls. It's about having the courage to let them fall." The applause that followed was scattered, uncertain. But Grace's eyes never left Daniel's, and in them he saw something that made his heart race. Later, as the event wound down, they found themselves alone on the building's rooftop garden. The city lights sparkled below, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of night-blooming jasmine. "Did you mean it?" Daniel asked quietly. "What you said in there?" Grace turned to him, her guard completely down. "Every word. Even though they're all probably plotting your downfall right now?" He tried to make it sound like a joke, but worry crept into his voice. "Let them plot." Grace stepped closer. "For the first time in my life, I'm not scared of losing control. I'm not scared of being real." Daniel could see the freedom in her eyes, the way she held herself. No longer the Ice Queen, but a woman finally allowing herself to feel. She was beautiful like this, more beautiful than he'd ever seen her. Without thinking, he leaned in. Grace's breath caught, her eyes fluttering closed. Their lips were inches apart, the moment electric with possibility. But then reality crashed back. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. He was still the mechanic she'd hired for show. She was still the CEO who lived in a different world. Daniel pulled back, his heart pounding. "Grace, She opened her eyes slowly, vulnerability, and something deeper swimming in their depths. The moment hung between them, fragile as spun glass. The city hummed below, oblivious to the two people on the rooftop, caught between what was real and what was pretend, neither daring to cross that final line. The mahogany-paneled boardroom felt smaller than usual as Grace sat at the head of the long table. 12 stern faces stared back at her, their expressions a mix of disapproval and concern. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished surface. "Miss Whitmore," Richard Sterling, the lead director, cleared his throat. "We've called this emergency meeting to address certain concerns about your recent personal choices." Grace's fingers tightened around her pen, but her face remained composed. She'd expected this conversation, but that didn't make it any easier. "Maxwell Holdings has presented us with an extremely generous merger offer," another board member, Janet Chen, added. "Their CEO, Thomas Maxwell, has expressed particular interest in a personal alliance as well." Grace's stomach churned. "I'm already married," she said firmly, though the words felt hollow knowing the truth behind her arrangement with Daniel. "Are you?" Richard's eyebrows rose. "To an auto mechanic from the wrong side of town? Grace, be reasonable. This isn't about happiness, it's about survival. Your father built this company from nothing. Are you willing to watch it crumble for the sake of some misguided romance?" Outside the boardroom, Daniel stood frozen in the hallway. He'd come to surprise Grace with lunch, something they'd started doing regularly. The secretary had waved him through, but now he wished she hadn't. Every word pierced his heart like shards of glass. "The media is already questioning your judgment," Janet continued inside. "A CEO of your caliber, playing house with a widowed mechanic and his son? It's unseemly. The shareholders are nervous. Daniel Carter is a good man." Grace's voice carried a dangerous edge. "He's honest, hard-working. He's beneath you," Richard cut in bluntly. "And he's destroying everything you've worked for. The Maxwell merger could save us from the fallout when your father's indiscretions come to light. Thomas Maxwell has the connections to bury that scandal forever." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. He'd known all along he wasn't good enough for Grace's world, but hearing it stated so coldly made his chest ache. "You have until the end of the week," Richard's voice was final. Either end this charade with Carter and accept Maxwell's offer, or watch your father's legacy disappear. The board will force a vote of no confidence. You'll lose everything. Grace stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. You can't. We can and we will. Janet's voice was gentler but no less firm. Grace, be sensible. This isn't just about you anymore. Think of your employees, their families. Thousands of jobs are at stake. Daniel backed away from the door, his heart pounding. He bumped into a side table, sending a vase crashing to the floor. The sound echoed through the quiet hallway. The boardroom door flew open. Grace stood there, her face pale as she saw Daniel. How long have you been? Long enough. Daniel's voice was rough. He looked at her, really looked at her. Elegant in her tailored suit, perfectly coiffed hair, diamond earrings catching the light. A world away from his grease-stained coveralls and calloused hands. They're right, Grace. No, Daniel, wait. She reached for him, but he stepped back. I heard everything. About Maxwell. About the merger. His smile was sad. About how I'm destroying everything you've built. That's not true. Grace's voice cracked. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Daniel cut her off gently. I've always known this was temporary. That I don't belong in your world. I just forgot for a while. Board members were gathering at the doorway now, watching the scene unfold. Their presence made Daniel's words stick in his throat, but he forced them out anyway. You need to do what's right for your company, Grace. For all those families depending on you. He swallowed hard. Ethan and I, we'll be fine. We always are. Daniel, please. Grace's composure was cracking. She took a step toward him, not caring about their audience. We can figure this out together. But Daniel was already backing away, his heart breaking with each step. Thank you, he said softly, for letting us pretend for a while, for making Ethan smile again. But it's time to stop pretending. He turned and walked toward the elevator, his steps echoing in the marble hallway. Behind him, he heard Grace call his name, her voice desperate and breaking. He wanted to turn back, to tell her that what they had wasn't pretend at all, that somewhere along the way his heart had forgotten this was just an arrangement. But he kept walking, each step harder than the last. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and he stepped inside. The last thing he saw before the doors closed was Grace standing in the hallway, one hand pressed against her heart, watching him leave. The elevator descended, taking him away from Grace's world and back to his own. Back to oil changes and spark plugs, to his small house and simple life. Back to reality, where fairy tales didn't exist, and auto mechanics didn't get to keep the CEO princesses they fell in love with. Outside, the evening air was cool against his face. Daniel walked into the gathering darkness, Grace's voice still echoing his name behind him. But he didn't turn back. He couldn't. Sometimes love meant knowing when to walk away, even when every step felt like walking on broken glass. The Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom buzzed with anticipation. Journalists clutched their notepads and microphones, cameras flashed like lightning, and the air felt thick with tension. Grace Whitmore stood behind the curtain, her hands smoothing down her cream-colored blazer for the 100th time. Daniel lingered near the back entrance, dressed in a suit that still felt foreign on his broad shoulders. His fingers played with the wedding band that had become both a comfort and a burden. He watched Grace from afar, memorizing the elegant curve of her neck, the way she held herself so perfectly straight even when no one was watching. You don't have to do this, her assistant whispered, adjusting Grace's microphone. The merger papers are ready. The board. Thank you, Sarah. Grace's voice was firm but gentle. I know what I'm doing. The spotlights blazed to life as Grace stepped onto the stage. Camera shutters clicked frantically. She approached the podium with measured steps, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The room fell silent, waiting. Good morning, she began, her voice clear and steady. Thank you all for coming today. I've called this press conference to address the recent speculation about my personal life and its impact on Whitmore Industries. Daniel shifted his weight, staying in the shadows. He'd come to say goodbye, to make it easier for her to choose her company over their pretense of a marriage. His heart ached watching her up there, so beautiful and distant. For generations, Whitmore Industries has stood for integrity, innovation, and family values. Grace paused, her fingers gripping the podium's edges. My father built this company on those principles, but somewhere along the way, we lost sight of what family truly means. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Daniel saw board members exchanging worried glances. 3 months ago, I made a decision based on corporate image. I entered into an arrangement that was meant to be purely business. Grace's eyes found Daniel's across the room. I hired a man to pretend to be my husband. Gasps erupted. Cameras flashed wildly. Daniel's chest tightened as reporters began shouting questions. Grace raised her hand for silence. But something unexpected happened. In trying to maintain an image, I found something real, something precious. Her voice softened. I found love. The room exploded with noise. Daniel froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Daniel Carter is not my fake husband, Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. He is the man who showed me what true strength looks like. Who taught me that real family isn't about board meetings and profit margins. It's about pancake breakfasts and bedtime stories. It's about loving someone enough to see past their walls. She stepped away from the podium, moving to the edge of the stage. Daniel is the man I love, not for show, not for business, but with every piece of my heart. Reporters surged forward, questions overlapping in a cacophony of voices. Board members stood up, faces red with anger. But Grace's eyes never left Daniel's. Something broke loose in Daniel's chest. Without thinking, he moved through the crowd, drawn to her like a tide to shore. The noise faded away until all he could hear was his own heartbeat. Grace descended the stairs as he approached. They met in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by flashing cameras and shocked faces. "You didn't have to do this," he whispered, close enough now to see the tears shining in her eyes. "Yes, I did." She smiled, trembling slightly. "I'm tired of pretending, tired of being afraid." Daniel took her hand, his rough fingers gentle against her soft skin. The simple gesture felt more intimate than any staged photo or practiced interaction they'd shared before. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Not for the cameras, not for show, but because his heart was too full to do anything else. The touch of his lips against her skin sent electricity through them both. Grace's breath caught, and for a moment the chaos around them disappeared. There was only this: his warmth, her trust, and the real love that had grown between them like a flower through concrete. The reporters pressed closer, shouting questions about the company, the board, the future, but Grace and Daniel remained in their bubble of quiet truth, his lips still pressed to her hand, her eyes still locked with his. For that perfect moment, it felt like their happy ending. Around them, the world continued to spin with consequences and complications, but in that space between heartbeats, they were simply a man and a woman who had found each other despite all odds. The pretense had fallen away, leaving only the raw, beautiful reality of their love. The cameras kept flashing, capturing the tender gesture for tomorrow's headlines. But neither Grace nor Daniel noticed. They were too busy discovering what it felt like to finally, truly, be real. The morning sun streamed through Grace's office windows, but its warmth couldn't reach her. Her hands trembled as she stared at the newspaper spread across her desk. The headline screamed in bold letters: "Auto Mechanic's Dark Past. Questions surround first wife's death." Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. The article painted Daniel as negligent, suggesting he'd failed to maintain their car properly, leading to the accident that took his wife's life. Grace knew it was a lie. She'd seen the police reports, the maintenance records Daniel kept meticulously filed. "Miss Whitmore?" Her assistant Sarah appeared at the door, face pale. "The board is demanding an emergency meeting. And the press. They're everywhere downstairs." Grace's computer pinged with another email alert. The company's stock was plummeting. Years of careful building, her father's legacy, all threatening to crumble because she'd dared to follow her heart. Daniel burst through the office doors, his usually calm face twisted with anguish. "Grace, I swear none of it's true. I would never—" His voice cracked. Sarah was sick, but the accident. "I checked that car myself. every day." "I know," Grace whispered, wanting desperately to go to him. Instead, she gripped her desk harder, her knuckles white. "But the damage is already done." "Mommy Grace?" Ethan's small voice came from behind Daniel. The boy clutched his favorite stuffed dinosaur, eyes wide with confusion. "Why are people saying mean things about Daddy?" Grace's heart shattered at the sight of him. Just yesterday, she'd helped him with his math homework, laughing over hot chocolate. Now, everything was falling apart. Her phone buzzed again, another board member demanding action. The message was clear. "Choose. Your company or them." "Daniel," she said, her CEO mask sliding into place, I think it's best if you and Ethan leave the mansion for now, until this blows over." "Grace, please." Daniel stepped forward, reaching for her hand. "We can fight this together. The truth doesn't matter." Her voice cracked. "Look at the markets. Look at what this is doing to my company, to my father's legacy. I can't." She swallowed hard. "I can't let it all fall apart." Ethan began to cry, soft hiccuping sobs that tore at Grace's soul. "You promised," he whimpered. "You promised you wouldn't leave like Mommy did." Daniel scooped Ethan up, holding him close. The boy buried his face in his father's neck, shoulders shaking. "It's okay, buddy," Daniel murmured. But his eyes were fixed on Grace, filled with hurt and understanding. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices." Grace turned to the window, unable to bear their gaze. Her reflection stared back at her. Perfect makeup, designer suit, not a hair out of place. The image of success she'd spent years crafting. Behind her, she heard Daniel gathering Ethan's backpack from the corner where he usually did his homework. "I'll have someone pack your things," she said to the window, her voice hollow. "And of course, I'll make sure you're compensated for." "Don't." Daniel's voice was quiet, but firm. "We don't want your money, Grace. We never did." She heard them moving toward the door, Ethan's sniffles growing quieter. Her heart screamed at her to turn around, to stop them, to choose love over legacy. But her feet remained frozen to the floor. "Grace?" Daniel paused at the threshold. "Whoever planted that story, they're not trying to protect your company. They're trying to control you." The door clicked shut behind them. Grace pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching as Daniel emerged from the building minutes later. He buckled a still-crying Ethan into his car seat, then stood for a moment, looking up at her window. Even from this height, she could feel the weight of his gaze. Her phone buzzed again, the board demanding her presence. Behind her, Sarah cleared her throat gently. "Miss Whitmore, they're waiting." Grace watched Daniel's old pickup pull away from the curb, taking with it everything warm and real in her life. A single tear rolled down her cheek as she whispered, "I'm so sorry." Sarah stepped closer, holding out a tissue. Should I call the PR team?" Grace squared her shoulders, wiping away the tear. The mask slipped back into place, cool, controlled, untouchable. But inside, where no one could see, her heart lay in pieces on the floor of her perfect office, in her perfect tower, surrounded by the perfect life that had never felt more empty. The key rattled in the lock as Daniel pushed open the front door to his modest two-bedroom house. The familiar creaky floorboards and worn furniture that had always meant home now felt heavy with loss. Ethan trudged in behind him, his small shoulders slumped, dragging his backpack across the floor instead of bouncing through the door like usual. "How about some hot chocolate, buddy?" Daniel tried to inject cheerfulness into his voice, but it came out strained. He hung his jacket on the hook by the door, the same hook where Grace had placed her designer coat just days ago. Ethan climbed onto one of the kitchen chairs, his eyes red and puffy. "Dad?" His voice quivered. "Did we do something wrong? Is that why Grace doesn't want to be our family anymore?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. He gripped the counter, the metal tin of hot chocolate powder forgotten in his hand. How could he explain to a 7-year-old what he barely understood himself? The cruel headlines, the whispers about his late wife Sarah, the way Grace had stepped back when he'd tried to defend himself, it all swirled in his mind. "No, buddy," Daniel finally managed, his throat tight. Sometimes grown-up things are complicated. He busied himself with heating milk, desperate to hide the moisture in his eyes from his son. "But she read me stories," Ethan persisted, his lower lip trembling. "And she made pancakes with funny faces. She said she liked being with us." Daniel set 2 mugs on the table, the chocolate steaming. "I know, Ethan. I know she did." He ruffled his son's hair, remembering how Grace's elegant fingers had done the same, how her corporate mask had melted when she played with Ethan. Ethan wrapped his small hands around the warm mug but didn't drink. "Can't you fix it? Like you fix cars?" "Some things can't be fixed, buddy." Daniel's voice cracked. "Sometimes we just have to be brave and keep going. Just you and me." Across town, Grace stood alone in her boardroom, staring out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the early evening. The room still echoed with heated voices from the emergency meeting that had just ended. Her usual power suit felt like armor, but for once, it wasn't protecting her. "Miss Whitmore?" Her assistant's voice was tentative. "The PR team has drafted a statement distancing the company from Mr. Carter." Grace's reflection in the window looked pale, almost ghostly. "No," she said quietly, then turned, her voice stronger. "No statements yet, but the board insisted I need to see the source documents for that article." Grace moved to her desk, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Every email, every interview, every piece of evidence they claimed to have. Her assistant hesitated. "The newspaper is protecting their source." Grace's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up files. "Then we'll find it ourselves." She paused, remembering Daniel's face when she'd stepped away from him, the hurt in his eyes. Sarah Carter's death was investigated. There were medical records, police reports. Daniel. Her voice softened on his name. Daniel loved her. He would never. She worked through the night, sending her assistant home hours ago. The office was silent, except for the hum of her computer and the occasional ping of incoming emails. She created a timeline, tracking the story's development, who had access to what information, when the first whispers had started. A pattern emerged. The leak had come after her public declaration of love for Daniel. The details were too precise, too calculated to destroy not just his reputation but hers. Someone had accessed sealed medical records, twisted facts, and planted the story with surgical precision. Grace's hands stilled over her keyboard as she opened an email thread. There it was, a message chain between two board members, discussing her unfortunate choice weeks before the story broke. They'd been waiting, planning, building their case against Daniel. Her own board. People she'd trusted, who'd worked with her father. They'd rather destroy an innocent man than see her choose love over their narrow vision of success. The betrayal burned, but it also sparked something else. Determination. Grace stood, walking to her father's old portrait on the wall. She'd spent years protecting his legacy, but what about her own? What about the legacy of love and truth that Daniel had shown her? She returned to her desk and began to gather evidence. Emails, meeting minutes, financial records, anything that showed the deliberate campaign against Daniel. Her fingers moved with renewed purpose, her spine straightening with each damning piece she uncovered. Dawn was breaking when Grace finally sat back, a file of evidence before her. She might lose her company, but she wouldn't lose herself. Not again. Daniel had taught her that some things were worth fighting for, and now she would fight not just for him and Ethan, but for the woman she discovered she could be when she was with them. She picked up her phone, ready to call her lawyer, when a final email caught her eye. It was from the board chairman to an anonymous account, dated just before the story broke. "Once this hits the papers, she'll have no choice but to accept the merger. The Carter problem will solve itself." Grace's lips curved into a hard smile. They had underestimated her, forgotten that she wasn't just her father's daughter, she was a woman who had built an empire, and now she would use every weapon in her arsenal to protect what mattered most. Her finger hovered over the intercom. The board had taught her to be ruthless in business. It was time to show them just how well she'd learned that lesson. Grace's heels clicked sharply against the marble floor of Whitmore Industries' executive level. Her face was set in granite, her designer blazer armor against what was to come. Through the glass walls, she could see Bernard Matthews, her senior board member, preparing for the emergency meeting she'd called. The conference room fell silent as she entered. Bernard's usual smug smile faltered when he saw the thick manila folder in her hands. "I know it was you," Grace said, her voice steady despite the rage simmering beneath. She dropped the folder onto the polished conference table. Photos, emails, and bank statements spilled out. Bernard's face paled. "I don't know what you're talking about, Grace." "Really?" She spread out several documents. "These are records of payments from your private account to Jeremy Collins at the Daily Herald, the same journalist who wrote that horrible piece about Daniel's wife." Grace's fingers trembled slightly, but her voice remained ice cold. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" Bernard stood, adjusting his tie. "You're making dangerous accusations, Grace. Remember who helped build this company with your father." "You mean like how you helped my father implement those discriminatory hiring practices years ago?" Grace watched satisfaction crack Bernard's facade. "Oh yes, I found those documents too." The door opened, and Daniel stepped in quietly. Grace had called him earlier, explaining everything. He looked out of place in his work clothes among the suits, but his presence steadied her. "Mr. Matthews," Daniel said, his voice firm but calm. "I spoke with Sarah Johnson's doctor today. You know, my late wife's physician. He's quite angry about how his words were twisted in that article." Bernard's composure cracked. "You have no right to be here. This is a board meeting." "He has every right," Grace cut in, "especially since we're discussing how you tried to destroy his reputation to force me into that merger deal with Preston Industries." She pulled out another document. "A merger that would have given you a very generous golden parachute, according to this contract draft." The other board members murmured, looking between Bernard and Grace. Bernard's face had turned an ugly shade of red. "You're just like your father," Bernard spat. "Too emotional, too attached to the wrong people. This company needs—" "What this company needs," Grace interrupted, "is integrity, something you clearly lack." She turned to face the rest of the board. "I have proof that Mr. Matthews not only planted false stories about Daniel Carter, but also attempted to manipulate company stock through insider trading." The room erupted in chaos. Bernard lunged for the documents, but Daniel stepped forward, his solid presence blocking the way. Security guards appeared at the door. Grace had planned everything. "You can either resign quietly," Grace said to Bernard, "or I take this to the authorities. Your choice." Hours later, after lawyers had been called and statements had been signed, Grace sat across from Daniel in a small diner, far from the corporate towers. It was nearly midnight, and the fluorescent lights cast a soft glow over their coffee cups. "Thank you," Grace said softly, "for helping me. You didn't have to." Daniel stirred his coffee slowly. "I couldn't let him destroy your company, or let those lies about Sarah stand." Their eyes met across the Formica table. The same electricity that had always been there crackled between them, stronger now for all they'd been through. Grace's hand rested near her coffee cup, and Daniel's fingers twitched as if wanting to reach for it. "How's Ethan?" Grace asked, her voice catching slightly. "He misses you," Daniel admitted. "We both do." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Grace's eyes softened, vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. Daniel's gaze held hers, warm and steady, full of things unsaid. The tired waitress refilled their cups, breaking the moment. But as they sat in the quiet diner, surrounded by the soft clink of dishes and distant conversation, the wall between them had begun to crack. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Daniel's modest living room windows. Grace sat on the worn but comfortable couch, files spread across the coffee table between her and Daniel. They'd been reviewing evidence against Bernard for hours, their voices low and serious. Neither noticed the small figure in Superman pajamas hovering near the hallway entrance. "We have enough to prove Bernard orchestrated the whole thing," Grace said, running her finger along a line of bank transactions. "The payments to the journalist, the planted story about—" She trailed off, pain flickering across her face. "About Sarah," Daniel finished quietly, his hand unconsciously touching the wedding ring he still wore on a chain around his neck. "I can't believe they'd use her death like that. I'm so sorry, Daniel. I should have fought harder. Should have stood by you instead of—" A small sniffle from the hallway made them both turn. Ethan stood there, his brown eyes wide and wet, clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur. "Ethan," Daniel said softly. "Buddy, you should be in bed." But Ethan's gaze was fixed on Grace. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, until he stood right in front of her. "Are you going away again?" His voice trembled. Grace's breath caught. "Ethan, please, don't leave us again." Tears spilled down his cheeks. "I promise I'll be extra good. I'll clean my room every day and eat all my vegetables, and—" His words dissolved into hiccups. Grace felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling. Without thinking, she opened her arms, and Ethan crashed into them, burying his face in her shoulder. His small body shook with sobs. "I miss you reading me stories," he whispered against her neck. "I miss making pancakes with you on Saturdays. I miss you tucking me in and kissing my forehead like Mommy used to." Daniel moved to intervene, but Grace shook her head slightly, holding Ethan closer. Her own tears fell freely now, dropping onto Ethan's dark curls. "I've missed you too, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "So much. Every single day." Ethan pulled back just enough to look at her face. "Then why did you go away?" "Daddy was sad. I heard him crying in his room at night." Daniel made a soft sound, but Grace couldn't look at him yet. Her heart felt like it might burst from the pain and love warring inside it. "I was scared," she admitted, smoothing Ethan's hair back from his forehead. "I've spent so long thinking I had to be perfect that I had to protect my father's company above everything else. But I was wrong, Ethan. So wrong." "So," she glanced up at Daniel then, finding his eyes full of an emotion she couldn't quite read. Looking back at Ethan, she continued, "Being with you, and your daddy, it showed me what really matters. You taught me about love, about family, real family." Ethan's small hand reached up to wipe a tear from her cheek. "Does that mean you'll stay?" Grace took a deep breath. Her next words meant for both Carter men. "If you'll have me, I want to stay forever. Because I love you, Ethan. And I love your father, too." The room grew very still. Ethan's eyes widened with hope, but Grace couldn't bring herself to look at Daniel yet. "I don't want to be just a CEO anymore," she continued softly. "I want to be Ethan's mother, if he'll let me. I want lazy Sunday mornings and bedtime stories and family dinners where we talk about our days. I want to watch you grow up, help you with your homework, cheer at your baseball games." She finally turned to Daniel, her heart in her eyes. "And I want to share it all with you, Daniel, not because of any contract or business arrangement, but because somewhere between the pretending and the truth, I fell completely in love with you both." Daniel moved slowly from his chair to kneel beside them. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for Grace's. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Grace, I'm still just a mechanic. Your world is so different from ours." "My world was empty," she said firmly, squeezing his hand. "All those galas and board meetings and billion-dollar deals, none of it meant anything until I had you two to come home to. You showed me what real wealth is, Daniel. It's this. It's family." Ethan wiggled between them, his face bright with joy. "Does this mean you'll be my new mommy for real?" Grace's heart swelled. "Only if that's what you want, sweetheart." "I want it more than anything." Ethan threw his arms around both their necks, pulling them close together. Daniel's free hand came up to cup Grace's cheek, his thumb brushing away her tears. "I never stopped loving you," he admitted quietly. "Even when I thought I should." "I don't deserve a second chance," Grace whispered. "Maybe not," Daniel said, a gentle smile touching his lips. "But I believe in us. In what we could be, what we already are, really. A family." His hand was warm and strong in hers, anchoring her to this moment, to this choice. Grace felt decades of loneliness and pressure falling away, replaced by something far more precious, belonging. The marble halls of Whitmore Industries headquarters buzzed with anticipation. Journalists packed the grand conference room, their cameras ready and notepads poised. The morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the crystal chandelier and scattering tiny rainbows across the sea of expectant faces. Grace stood behind the podium, her posture perfect in her cream-colored suit. But today, something was different. The usual Ice Queen facade had melted, replaced by quiet determination. To her right stood Daniel, looking distinguished yet approachable in a navy suit. His strong hands rested protectively on Ethan's shoulders. The boy fidgeted with his tie, but beamed proudly at his father and Grace. "Thank you all for coming," Grace began, her voice clear and steady. "Today, I stand before you not just as CEO of Whitmore Industries, but as someone who has learned the true meaning of integrity and courage from two remarkable people." She smiled at Daniel and Ethan, genuine warmth radiating from her expression. The room fell silent as Grace held up a thick folder. "What I'm about to share will shock many of you. For the past month, vicious rumors have circulated about Daniel Carter, questioning his character and the circumstances of his late wife's passing. These allegations were not just false, they were deliberately fabricated by someone within my own organization." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Camera shutters clicked rapidly. Bernard Matthews, a senior board member of Whitmore Industries, orchestrated this smear campaign. Grace's voice hardened as she projected documents onto the screen behind her. These records show payments made to journalist Thomas Webb, who published the false story. We have Mr. Webb's signed affidavit confirming Mr. Matthews's role. The journalists scribbled frantically, some already typing on their phones. Grace continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. But this revelation exposed something even deeper, a pattern of corruption that extends back decades. While investigating these events, I discovered troubling practices instituted during my father's leadership. Grace paused, emotion flickering across her face. Including discriminatory hiring policies that systematically excluded qualified candidates based on race and background. A collective gasp filled the room. Daniel squeezed Ethan's shoulders gently, his eyes never leaving Grace's face. "Today, I'm announcing not just the complete clearing of Daniel Carter's name, but also sweeping reforms at Whitmore Industries." Grace straightened her shoulders. "We're establishing a diversity and inclusion board with real power to oversee hiring practices. We're creating a scholarship fund for underprivileged students, and we're partnering with community organizations to provide job training and opportunities." She took a deep breath. "My father built this company on innovation, but also on prejudices that have no place in today's world. It's time to honor what was good in his legacy while correcting what was wrong." A reporter's hand shot up. "Miss Whitmore, how can you guarantee these changes will be meaningful and not just cosmetic?" Grace smiled. "Because I've learned firsthand the cost of judging people by their social status or background. When I met Daniel Carter, I saw him only as someone who could help maintain my image. Instead, he taught me about genuine integrity, about the strength it takes to raise a child alone, about the kind of leader I want to be." Ethan broke free from Daniel's grip and ran to Grace's side, wrapping his arms around her waist. The cameras went wild, capturing the moment of unscripted tenderness as Grace placed her hand on his head. "The board has approved these changes," Grace continued, her voice thick with emotion. "Those who oppose them, including Mr. Matthews, have been asked to resign. Whitmore Industries will no longer be known for its cold corporate culture, but for its heart." The questions came rapid fire after that. Grace handled each one with grace and honesty, never flinching from the hard truths. Daniel stepped forward to answer questions about the false allegations, his quiet dignity winning over even the most skeptical reporters. As the conference drew to a close, Grace stepped away from the podium. She reached for Daniel's hand, then took Ethan's in her other. The three of them stood together, a united front against the flashing cameras. "One last question, Miss Whitmore," called out a veteran reporter from the back. "Your relationship with Mr. Carter, was it ever really just business?" Grace looked at Daniel, her eyes soft with affection. She turned back to the crowd, her smile genuine and free. "The contract might have brought us together, but love kept us there. Sometimes the heart knows better than the head." More cameras flashed, capturing the moment. But Grace barely noticed them anymore. For the first time since inheriting her father's empire, the weight of expectations and appearances lifted from her shoulders. Standing between Daniel and Ethan, their hands warm in hers, she felt something she'd almost forgotten existed: freedom. The morning sun caught her diamond earrings, sending sparkles dancing across her face. But it was her smile that truly shone, bright with the promise of tomorrow, and the joy of finally, truly, being herself. The aroma of slightly burnt lasagna wafted through Daniel's modest kitchen as the evening sun cast long shadows through the living room windows. Grace sat at the worn oak dining table beside Ethan, her designer blazer draped over a kitchen chair, sleeves rolled up as she helped him with his math homework. So, if Jenny has 12 marbles, and she gives away 5, Grace pointed to the worksheet with her pencil. Ethan's forehead wrinkled in concentration. 7. She has 7 marbles left. His face lit up with pride. That's exactly right. Grace gave him a high five, her heart warming at his delighted giggle. In the kitchen, Daniel struggled with the smoking oven, muttering under his breath as he pulled out the slightly blackened pasta dish. Well, folks, dinner might be a bit crispy tonight. Dad always burns the cheese on top, Ethan whispered to Grace, loud enough for Daniel to hear. I heard that, buddy, Daniel called out, making both Grace and Ethan laugh. Grace stood up, smoothing her silk blouse. Need some help in there? I think the damage is already done, Daniel chuckled, setting the dish on the counter. But maybe you can salvage the garlic bread. Grace walked into the kitchen, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. The kitchen was small, nothing like her professional-grade setup at home, but somehow it felt more alive, more real. She bumped shoulders with Daniel as she reached for the bread, and the casual contact sent a pleasant shiver through her. I can't remember the last time I actually cooked, she admitted, pulling the garlic bread from the oven. Everything's always catered or restaurant, delivered. Well, you're in for a treat then, Daniel grinned, gesturing to the burnt lasagna. Carter family specialty, extra crispy. They set the table together, moving around each other in an easy rhythm. Ethan cleared away his homework, carefully placing his math worksheet in his folder. Can we have ice cream after dinner? He asked hopefully. Let's see if we survive dinner first. Daniel winked at Grace. As they settled around the table, Grace noticed the little details she'd missed in her old life. The way Ethan's feet swung beneath his chair, not quite reaching the floor. The gentle hum of the ceiling fan. The warm yellow light from the simple pendant lamp above them. It felt like home in a way her massive penthouse never had. They said, Grace, something Grace hadn't done since childhood, and dug in. The lasagna was indeed crispy on top, but underneath it was perfectly good. They talked about Ethan's day at school, about the classic car Daniel was restoring at the shop, about nothing and everything. You've got sauce on your chin, Daniel told Grace, reaching over to wipe it away with his napkin. The tender gesture made her breath catch. This is nice, Ethan declared, looking between them with hopeful eyes. Like a real family. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. She reached for her water glass to hide her emotion, but Daniel caught her other hand under the table, squeezing gently. After dinner, they worked together to clean up. Ethan on drying duty while Grace washed, and Daniel put things away. There was a small splash fight that left water spots on Grace's silk blouse, but she found she didn't care. My cleaning service would be horrified, she laughed, wiping suds from her nose. Welcome to real life. Daniel smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Later, they helped Ethan with his bedtime routine. Grace sat on the edge of his race car bed while Daniel read a chapter from his favorite book. Watching them together, seeing the love between father and son, made her heart ache with longing and fulfillment all at once. Good night, Grace. Ethan mumbled sleepily as they turned out his light. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad I'm here too, sweetheart, she whispered, fighting back tears. Back in the living room, Grace sank onto the comfortable old couch, kicking off her heels. I can't remember the last time I felt this peaceful, she admitted. My house is 4 times this size, but it's never felt as much like home as this does. Daniel sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. You belong here, Grace. With us. If you want to. She turned to face him, her heart pounding. I do want to. More than anything. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Then Daniel leaned in, one hand coming up to cup her cheek. His lips met hers in a gentle kiss, tender and sweet and full of promise. Grace melted into it, her hands finding his shoulders as everything else fell away. When they finally pulled apart, they were both smiling. Daniel rested his forehead against hers, his thumb stroking her cheek. "I've wanted to do that for a long time," he murmured. "Me too," Grace whispered back, her heart full to bursting with joy and love and possibility. Sunlight dappled through the maple trees at Riverside Park, casting dancing shadows on the red and white checkered blanket where Grace, Daniel, and Ethan had spread out their Sunday picnic. The late spring air carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers and fresh-cut grass, while children's laughter echoed from the nearby playground. Grace smoothed her simple sundress, so different from her usual power suits, as she unpacked sandwiches from the wicker basket. She'd made them herself that morning, the bread slightly uneven but filled with love. Daniel had teased her about the crooked cuts, but his eyes had sparkled with affection. "Can I go play on the swings?" Ethan bounced on his knees, barely able to contain his energy. His hair was tousled from the breeze, his cheeks pink with excitement. "After you eat at least half your sandwich," Daniel said, ruffling his son's hair. "Can't have you running on an empty stomach, buddy." Ethan grabbed his peanut butter and jelly sandwich, taking enormous bites. Grace couldn't help but laugh at his enthusiasm. "Slow down, sweetheart. The playground isn't going anywhere." A few minutes later, Ethan raced toward the swings, where other children were already playing. Grace watched him go, her heart full of a love she'd never imagined possible just months ago. Daniel's hand found hers on the blanket, his touch warm and reassuring. "He's so happy," Grace murmured, leaning against Daniel's shoulder. "I never thought I could have this." "Have what?" Daniel asked softly, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "This. Family. Love." Grace gestured to the scene around them. Families enjoying the weekend, children playing, the simple joy of being together. "I spent so many years building walls, thinking success meant never needing anyone." From the playground, they heard Ethan's voice rise above the others. "That's my mommy and daddy over there." He was pointing toward their blanket, talking to a small group of children. "My mommy runs a big company, but she makes the best sandwiches now too." Grace's breath caught in her throat, tears welling in her eyes. The word mommy still hit her heart like a burst of sunshine every time she heard it. Daniel squeezed her hand, understanding the depth of emotion behind those tears. "Remember when he first called you that?" Daniel asked, his voice gentle. "You looked like someone had knocked the wind out of you." Grace laughed softly, wiping at her eyes. "I was terrified. I thought I'd mess it up, that I couldn't possibly be what he needed, what you both needed. And now look at you," Daniel said, pride evident in his voice. "The great Grace Whitmore, making peanut butter sandwiches and playing catch in the backyard. And loving every minute of it." Grace watched as Ethan showed another child how to pump his legs on the swing, his face bright with joy. "You know, I used to think love was a weakness. My father taught me that. 'Never let them see your heart, Grace,' he'd say. 'It's the surest way to lose.'" Daniel shifted to face her, his eyes serious but warm. "And what do you think now?" "I think," Grace paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think love is the greatest strength there, Island. It took losing everything I thought I wanted to find what I really needed." A group of children ran past their blanket, giggling and chasing a butterfly. Grace watched them, remembering her own lonely childhood in a mansion full of rules and expectations. How different Ethan's life was, full of laughter, messy moments, and unconditional love. "Thank you," Daniel said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. "For what?" "For believing in love again. For giving us a chance. For being brave enough to let go of everything you thought you needed to grab hold of what you really wanted." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "For becoming the mother Ethan needed, even when it scared you." Grace felt tears threatening again. "I should be thanking you. You and Ethan showed me what real love looks like. Not the kind that comes with conditions or expectations, but the kind that just island." From the playground, Ethan's voice called out, "Mommy, Daddy, come push me on the swings." They stood together, brushing grass from their clothes. Grace kicked off her sandals, enjoying the feel of warm grass between her toes. Another simple pleasure she denied herself for too long. As they walked toward the playground, Ethan ran to meet them halfway, grabbing both their hands. "Higher, Daddy! I want to go higher than the clouds!" Daniel laughed. "Higher than the clouds? I don't know about that, buddy." "Mommy will help," Ethan declared confidently. "She's strong too." Grace felt her heart swell with love for this little boy who had so completely claimed her as his own. She squeezed his small hand, marveling at how perfectly it fit in hers. The sun was warm on their faces as they walked together, their shadows merging on the grass. Grace felt Daniel's strong hand in hers, Ethan's trusting grip on the other side, and knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. Ethan skipped between them, tugging them forward with the boundless energy of childhood. Other families smiled as they passed, recognizing the joy radiating from their little group. Grace smiled back, no longer the untouchable CEO, but simply a mother walking with her family on a beautiful Sunday morning. They reached the swings, where Ethan scrambled onto the seat, looking at them both with shining eyes. The sunlight caught his hair, turning it to gold, and Grace's heart felt so full it might burst. Daniel moved behind the swing, hands ready to push, while Grace stood to the side, ready to catch and encourage. They worked in perfect harmony, just as they did in all things now, partners in love, in parenting, in life. "Ready?" Daniel asked, grinning at their son. "Ready!" Ethan exclaimed, gripping the chains tightly. Grace watched as Daniel gave the first gentle push, sending their son soaring toward the sky, toward his dreams of touching the clouds. Ethan's laughter rang out, pure and joyful, a sound that made everything right in the world. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel Carter, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.